So what I'm going to do today is give you a demonstration of the new Foundry template that we're releasing for budgeting. So if you haven't dealt with the Foundry before, Foundry is a tool for rapid prototyping and developing environments where it creates the underlying data structure as well as a data model, as well as a web front end, including data entry forms and reports through a web browser. So it's all encapsulated within the Foundry. And the Foundry project is supplied with a number of standard templates. Now, a lot of them originally were just showing functionality. We're now moving into that next phase where we're actually supplying templates which you can actually use. And one of the ones we're putting out now is what we call a multi-period budget sample. So it's actually a generic budgeting environment that allows you to do budgeting for multiple periods through a web browser, which poses certain technical challenges, which we've got a nice simple example of how to set that up. I'm not going to use the template that's in there. I'm actually going to go for the very latest version, which I haven't even got into the build yet. So I'll open up this Foundry project. So the Foundry project is made up of tables. So because it's budget based, you've got budget lines, you've got a couple of different views of the budget, so budget by period and a budget summary, and I'll come back and explain what those are. You've also got a number of dimensional tables, so account type, analysis codes, and then there's various other tables that just give you a structure to allow you to budget. Now, it's been built along the lines of you could use it over different styles of systems. So, for example, SAP Business One, Infor Systems, Dynamics GP. It's really built generic in structure, though because it is a Foundry project, you could extend it further. So that's probably the key thing. It's not locked in stone. It's something that can be molded to your specific requirements of the underlying system. So the best way to illustrate the Foundry is I will actually deploy this Foundry project. So I will just kick it off. So I'm actually going to execute it. So it's coming up with a message. It's going to create the database. So it creates a SQL Server database, a data model, and a report pack. And the report pack is that web front end. So it's going through, it's generating the data model. Do you actually, now I've got an existing data model there. Yes, I want to overwrite that. It's now creating the database. Now deploying the published queries. And it's now trying to stop and start the service, but I don't have a Sharperlight service running. So it's generated everything. Because I'm doing a demonstration, oh, hang on a sec. Okay, I forgot that I've got it to auto load. So because it's a demonstration environment, I've actually got a sample load sheet with data that I can use to populate into this environment. So I'm actually just going to run that. So it's going to go through and run these individual sheets from left to right, and it'll actually come back with a notice board of the records that have been written and the success of each write back. So I'll kick this right back off. And it's finished. It's come back with success on all of them, and you can see the rows that it's actually created. So I can actually change this workbook, close it. And I will now, well, actually before I close the Foundry project, I'll actually start the service. So normally you'd be running the Sharperlight service as a Windows service. Because this is a demonstration environment, I'm running the manual service, so I've got control that I can easily go in and stop and start the service without going into the Windows service control. Okay, I can hide that, and I can use this link to open up the main menu. So the Foundry generates a main menu page. Now I'm going to log in as the admin user. Now normally I would use Windows Authenticated Security, but in this example I actually want to be able to log out and log in as a couple of different people. So in this case here I've turned off Windows Authenticated users and I'm just logging in as a native user. So this is the main landing page that the Foundry project actually created, and I've got menus, and it's been grouped up into individual folders where I can actually access information. Now, unlike a traditional sort of menu where you've got reports hanging off these, there's still kind of reports, but there are also data entry forms as well. So I could go in here and I could modify this, submit that change, and it would actually be updated into the underlying database. Equally, I could delete the record if I wanted to. Now, normally what happens with the Foundry project is it creates a main landing page, and most people then customize that specifically to their requirements. So in my case here, I've already created a custom landing page called a menu. So this again looks pretty much the same as before. I've just built a dashboard and I've added a couple of new things to the menu. So under maintenance, I've added a couple of new things here. Apart from that, most of the other things, and there's a reports folder. So I've added some reports, which we'll come back and have a look at. What I also want to do is show how the security works, and the best way to illustrate that is to actually run another login. So I'm opening up Firefox so I don't get the two sessions conflicting. Basically, the cookies that I create from the session, if I use Chrome, it'll actually think that whoever the last one I logged in as will be that user. In this case here, because Firefox and Chrome are completely separate, I know that I've got user 1 sitting here and I've got admin sitting over here. Now, the first thing you actually notice is me logging in as user 1, and user 1 is kind of the sales manager in this demonstration environment. So he's actually seeing less information that the admin user is seeing. He only gets to see one row of the approvals, and he only gets to see the revenue information, which funnily enough is the sales, and he gets to see none of the costs because he doesn't have access to that. So that's an example of row-level security. And we'll come back and look at that in a little bit more detail. So what we want to do is we just want to start off with some of the basic sort of concepts. So I'm going to open up the budget line and I'm going to change the accounting period. So submit on that. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a change to one line, just that top line. And I'm just going to modify it and say, okay, I really want the balance to be 900. I hit submit that. And what it does, it updates the budget line, which is effectively the table that I'm editing, and it trapped who made the change, because I'm currently logged in as the admin user, and it's got the modified date time. Now we're going to come back and look at this change later on under auditing, but that's just kind of getting us started. Now, the whole budgeting concept here is based around the idea that you have a baseline budget. So you either upload a basic budget from Excel, or you take last year's actuals and kind of normalize it or round it and suck it into this database using writeback. And that gives you all the combinations of account codes and the dimensions that you expect people to actually enter data this year. So rather than saying, okay, you can enter data using any account in any dimensions you like, and what you end up is a real hodgepodge of budget numbers where people are actually updating sales numbers under office expenses and things like that. So this baseline concept, which is pretty common around budgeting tools, is the starting point here. So that's why we have a base set of transactions that we're bringing in. You could bring it in as all zeros if you wanted to. It would still be valid, and then people can enter the data afterwards, but it's always easier to actually start them off with at least a starting point, a number, which is pretty much what I've done. So I've done a change here. What I'll also do is go into the budget by period, which is probably how I see most people actually entering the data. And I will just submit this. So this, unlike the previous example where we've actually got a budget line, so it's the individual lines, this is actually the budget by individual period. So it's actually pivoted it. And you've got period 1 to 12. Now, the structure here is it's a view over the budget line table. So if I make changes to this, it's actually making changes back into the budget line table. There is no budget by period table in the database. So the changes here go back to the budget line. So you can see here that that account that we changed before, which was period 8, you can actually see that you've got that change there. Now, at the moment, I'm still in a reporting view, so this is not a data entry view. If I was to click on this, it'll open it up, and I could go in and I could actually make a change to that. So let's say, for example, if I want to change that to 1,000, and I submit that change, it'll go away and it'll now be 1,000. But again, that's probably not how most people want to do it. How people want to change data in the web is through a grid interface. So we have a specific grid-based data entry form. So in this case here, I will just make sure I've got the right year, I've got the right version. Company, submit on that. So this is the full data entry form, which is different to what we had before, which was effectively a report. Now with this, you can actually type directly into the cells. So if I want to change that to 1100, and if I've got my number lock on, which I now do, so that's just updated it and it's now 1100. Now, if I was to go back and try to change period 1, jump off, shows a little orange highlighter in the corner to indicate that that cell's been changed. If I click off that row, it actually goes to update it, and it comes back with a message over here. The period 2017-001 is locked. So those transactions have actually previously been entered, or they've been entered, and somebody has defined that they should be locked. Now, within this budgeting template, you've got the ability to lock individual periods and lock individual years, and that's just an overall sort of thing. It also has an approval process where if you approve up to a certain period, it will actually lock all prior periods in the current year. So I know that I've actually got an approval in force up to period 6. So it won't allow me to make any changes to these accounts up to period 6, but I can make sure it changes from period 7 onwards, because that is still open for modification. But we'll come back and talk about approvals and locks a little bit further. Now, what I want to do is just show some of the interesting functionality that you have available with this table. Now, I'm just going to change, so instead of the sales accounts, I will actually change to just some normal expense accounts. On that. Okay, here we go. So let's just say, now, if I just wanted to go through and make all these accounts 10, 10, 10, click off, it goes away. Now, those accounts didn't have transactions where it had 0, because I've set this data set up that way, so there was no transactions. So what it does is, based on the information it has, as in the company and the account, the version, the scope, which I will come back and explain, and also the analysis dimensions, it actually says, well, I've got all the criteria to create a row. So if you enter into a area in the grid where there is no transaction, it will actually use the elements that make up that row and create a row for you, which is exactly what I've just done. Now, one of the things you can do is, instead of individually picking out numbers and changing it, you can actually do changes to multiple periods. So let's say, for example, I want to update everything by $10 from period 8 to period 12. If I type in 50 here and click off, now it's changed that, but it hasn't updated these. If I just refresh this, it's actually taken the 50 and added 10 to every individual period. And that's what this distribution method is all about. So the default distribution method is you just type in a number and it'll just overwrite the number that actually exists there. Whereas with these distribution methods, even will actually spread a value that you type into future periods up to the end of the year. Weighted, it'll actually take, based on the number that's already in a cell, it will actually weight the value. And minus, obviously, it's going to take whatever number you type in, it'll deduct it. And plus, it'll add it to the number. So they're just some of the more advanced functions you get around the distribution around this screen. Okay, now, one of the things to consider is that, okay, if you want to make this available to number of users, you don't want them to actually coming in and actually setting the filter criteria. You just want to give them a grid and say, this is your budget, I want you to enter into it. So what you can do is you can set the filter criteria and you can then open it in a new window and it'll go straight to that slice of the information. So you could send this web address in a link and say, this is your budget, this is what you need to enter into. And that is just a simple way of packaging up just that view and giving it to someone. It doesn't rely on security, so you could have a level of security over and above that, which actually says, well, they can only see this company and this account, this version, and obviously they can't modify certain periods if they've been locked away. And you've got security over all the dimensions as well. So you've got, that's another level of security, whereas this is just a way of packaging up a data entry grid and say, this is what I want you to actually use for your data entry. So I'll just go back to the main form and just very, very quickly come down and actually just repeat what we were doing up here. Now, budget by periods. Now, if I submit here, because we're dealing with the sales manager in this other login, he only has access to the accounts which are within the sales scope. So scope is a global sort of value, a global dimension, which you can tie into different data sets, and you can use it to both upload certain data sets. You can also use it to restrict certain data sets. So in this demonstration environment, I've got a number of different scopes. I've got a sales scope, a fabrication scope, which is effectively manufacturing, an employee scope, and then all the other sort of accounts are general. And I've got security set up so that some people can access fabrication and others can't. The salesperson can only see accounts which fall in the sales scope. And obviously admin has access to everything. So it's just a very simple example of the security. And again, I'll come back and talk about it in a little bit more detail. So what I wanted to talk about now was approvals. So I'll just open up the approval structure. So in this budget template, we've got two level approvals. So it's pretty much you have a budget manager and you have a budget holder. When you set up an approval, you create the row and you define who the budget manager is and who the budget holder is. From then on, both the budget manager and the budget holder can come in and edit this and modify this. Each of those different budget controllers have different access. So the budget manager can modify the whole role. The budget holder can only modify the status and make comments. When the budget manager is satisfied that all the information has been updated appropriately, and let's say, for example, the budget for that specific scope relates to what they've agreed is going to be the budget for that next year or the current year, the budget manager can then approve that approval line. And in approving it, they lock it down. So they basically say it's now been approved. Nobody else can actually modify these records. Now, the approval is tied based on the intersect of a company, a version, and the scope, and the period. So basically, it's up to a certain period for that same company, version, and scope. So if we were the sales manager and he was to go in and say, okay, now he can only see one line here. So let's say he's actually done some work on the budget. He's updated a few details. He's like, yep. And he submits that. And he's now updated it. So it's tagged his modification and the time. We go back up here, hit submit, it refreshes that. Now, the budget manager, he may run a couple of the reports, look at the sales budget and say, well, hang on a sec, the sales budget, we're supposed to sell over $900,000 worth of goods in this next quarter or the next half year. But the numbers that are in the budget are less than that. Therefore, it's not really ready because those numbers need to be fixed up. Or work out, is the budget unattainable, or things like that. So the budget manager can then actually come in here and say, well, hang on a sec, it's actually incomplete. Now, there's different ways to actually note this, but this is probably not a bad way of actually just tacking towards the end and putting the name. Submit again. It's all good. We go back to the sales manager. Now, don't forget that the approval is actually on the dashboard page. So when that person logs in or goes to this part or goes to this menu page, it'll actually be on the main page. So they'll actually see these changes. And with Scheduler, you could actually set this up so that it actually sends updates as an email. So there's a couple of different ways you can actually send these notifications out. This case, let's say the person's gone through, checked it, said, yep. Fixed. And budget manager comes in, okay. He looks at it again, maybe it's been fixed or whatever. And once he's happy with it, he can then say, yes, I agree with that. I'm now going to approve that. And by changing that flag, it actually locks those transactions going forward into period 12. Hit submit. Now the budget manager, if for whatever reason something has changed and they say, oh, okay, you've approved that, but we want you to unapprove it, the budget manager can actually go in and say, okay, well, hang on a sec, we did say it's approved, but we just want to hold off. There's one change we want to make. So the budget manager can roll it back, whereas the budget holder cannot. So the budget holder, again, can only modify the status and the comment. They don't have access to the approval, and obviously can't change who the budget holder is or anything like that. That's purely the budget manager's sort of domain. So now we've made a couple of changes. We'll just skip ahead and look at the auditing. So we've made a couple of changes here, and I'm just going to look for the updates because we did insert a lot of data. So if you remember, I made that change to the budget line table and it was 900. Then I made a modification in the budget by period. So that was actually the data entry form, and I changed it to 1,000. And then when I was in the data entry grid, I changed it to 1,100. So you've got those three changes which have actually been recorded. And then you've got those changes that I did for updating it to 20. Now, you may notice that the records that I put in, which were updating it to 10 or adding 10, because they would have been inserts, because those rows didn't actually exist in the budget. Now, some of the things you can actually do, so you've got inquiry capability, we've got reporting capability, which we'll get to. You've also got some bulk update data modification capabilities. So as part of the standard template, you've got an option where you can actually copy your budget information between different versions. So in this case here, let's say I want to copy the version that we've just uploaded. So we're going to take version 1 and I want to put all that data into a version 2. And if I say run and I submit it, it actually goes away, generates a row, but it also copies that information from company XYZ from version 1 into version 2. If I was to then run this again and try to recopy it, it'll actually give you an error because it'll say the version information already exists. So this sort of automation and data maintenance can actually be built into the Foundry project. We've started with a couple of simple ones. So we've got copying the budget version and deleting a budget version, but it'd be pretty easy to add some more in here, specific to what a customer needs. And then you can then set it up just as part of the web menu. The other thing that the Foundry project also supplies is the ability to capture input values. So with a lot of budgeting, it's not just a case of taking the number from last year and saying, well, we're going to do that plus 5%. A lot of the numbers you have in your budget, you've actually got some sort of quantifiable way of calculating it out. For example, sales. You know the number of units that you're planning to sell this year. You know the seasonality of when you generally sell those units, and you know the price. And you can play around with, well, should we increase the price? Should we lower the price? Are we going to be able to produce more units? What happens if we produce more units? So we can actually adjust those accordingly and look at the different sort of scenarios. So those input values you can actually store in a table. So if I was to go in here, and I'll just focus on the sales side, and I'll hit submit. So these are the input values which I've created for the sales side of the business, and they've obviously been given the scope sales. So I've got information in relation to the units that will be sold, the seasonality. So every month period, 1 to 12, will actually have its own seasonality, and an average price, so an average price for the unit. Now, these sort of things could be modified during the year, so you can actually adjust your pricing, you can also adjust your seasonality, or even the units are sold. Now, how do you then actually use these? Well, it's probably the best way to illustrate is within Excel. So a lot of these numbers are generally maintained in Excel, And they're generally put together by people who are specific to that role. So, for example, the sales manager or the person in charge of manufacturing or the HR person. You know, they may already be mocking this information up in Excel. So what I'll do is I'll go to a worksheet. Okay, so what I've done here is I've actually mocked up a load sheet showing the numbers, and I've got my metrics over here on the side. So these are the input values. Now, putting it into Excel just really kind of makes sense. It's just an easy way to actually go through and update it. Obviously, I could do it through the web browser, but with this, I can actually make the changes, I can upload it, and I can also report on those changes immediately. And then I could change it again. So I've got the full cycle. Now, these formulas here, if I was to just open up one of these, and what we've got is a query that's going back and actually pulling information out of the underlying data model, but I've actually created a custom table which does that calculation. So it takes the input values for sales and calculates them out. So if we do a little calculation here, so I've got this little custom, so that little bit of custom SQL there is actually taking those input values and multiplying them out to give me the value for the intersect of that spreadsheet in the background. So those changes, so I'm not actually updating them in the budget line yet. I'm actually just using this as a boilerplate to say, okay, if I make that change, what will the number change to? And once I'm happy with it, I can then use these to update the numbers in the budget line. So a very simple example with that is, so let's say, for example, I want to update some of these. So maybe 36 and 28. Now, if I want to go through and actually upload that, I can actually execute that, and it'll go away and actually write that information back into the underlying table. Got my little update over here. So 16 rows read, 16 rows affected. Now that change there just increased the number that I actually sold. So if I was to recalculate this range here, so I'm just going to recalculate the range. You can see that the actual total on the side here has actually gone up. So if you're aiming to hit a target, you can actually massage the numbers to say, okay, well, we're going to have to increase the sales value to hit, you know, 650,000, or maybe it's $700,000 over the year. So those small adjustments. And by doing that, you're actually changing the input metrics. So these input values here, you can then adjust the values accordingly. And you've then got the seasonality side over here. Now, one of the things you can do within Excel, and there's a couple of different ways you can actually do this data management side of input values, but just sticking with Excel at the moment, is you could actually query out the information that you've got in your budget line table, and you could actually delete those rows. So you could delete the existing sales records, because write back does have that ability to delete rows. So I can do a write back based on the row ID and say, these rows which I've extracted, delete these rows out of the budget line table. So this little simple spreadsheet here is basically, it pulls the current rows which relate to sales and a specific version. If I then do a write back, it'll actually go through and delete all these records here. Now, it will error because I've got approvals in place, because those periods are actually locked. So it'll come up with a message saying you can't do this because you've got an approval in place. But normally, if I didn't have approval, I could delete it. I could then query the updated numbers. So the sales calculation, this custom table that I actually created, is very similar to the budget line table. It's got the same sort of values or the same elements. All you need to do is just go through and say, okay, well, maybe I'll have a specific source. So I'll hard code a source on saying it's going to be calculation. And in this example here, the input values are actually using 3 different dimensions. So they go down to product. Whereas in my budget, we're not actually budgeting at a product level. It's only at the high level. It's department and cost center. So they're not including product. So we actually remove that analysis code and just set it as blank. So that basically builds the structure, and I could then use a write-back to actually upload this information, again, if I didn't have approvals in place, and it would basically create new records. The other alternative, instead of inserting, so delete and insert, you could also update the data. So I've got exactly the same query that I had on the insert sheet, but when I actually do the write-back, I actually send it to a budget summary table. So the budget summary is a little bit different. So the budget lines table is set up to take pretty much any record that you write to it, it'll create a separate row. So it doesn't try to do any update whatsoever. Whereas the budget summary table tries to summarize it so that if you've got the same combinations of company account, period, version, scope, source, and the analysis dimensions, it'll actually update that record. If you don't have that, or you've got the main keys, as in company account, period, version, scope, it will actually do a top-down update. So it'll actually say, okay, well, you've given me 1,000, so I will update the underlying records that make up that 1,000. So that's slightly different sort of logic. It's not a standard sort of record for record update. It's actually doing a top-down update, which is quite important for budgeting purposes, but I'll come back to that as well. Okay, in fact, what I'll do that is now, so I will just open up another sheet. Here we go. Okay. So this is the budget in Excel. So with the numbers now, if I was to go through and just recalculate this range, because I've actually been modifying it, so I'm just going to recalculate this range. Okay, so period 8 is the one that I've actually been changing. And if I was to drill into period 8, so go to the details, and I'll do all. You can actually see that there's 2 rows in period 8. One is 1,100 and the other one's $747. So we've been modifying one because it's a different region. So R20 as opposed to R60. Now, if at a high level, this is only using the account to return the balance. Now, if I wanted to update the intersect of that, we've actually got a write-back here. So I've got defined a matrix write-back for this whole sheet. But what we've got in the new release of Sharperlight, which is coming up, is what we call a write-back helper, which allows you to do cell-based write-back. So instead of trying to write back the whole sheet, you can actually write back that individual cell. Now, with the write-back helper actually loaded, if I was to then overtype and say, oh, yeah, okay, I can do that. I can do it there as well. I was going to type directly into the cell. If I apply that, what it does, it actually captures that I've changed that cell. It then runs a write-back, so that I've got a record of the write-back actually here. And I've actually got the write-back update here. And then it returns, because I've overwritten a cell, it actually returns it back to the original value and recalculates it. So it gives you the current balance. Now, if I was to then just overtype directly on that cell and change it to 1900, hit OK, it just does exactly the same thing again. So it does an update on it, does a write back, and then reverts it back to the underlying formula. And this is a good example of a top down. So I'm making high level changes And if I was to then drill into this, so I'm going to do the same drill down that I did before. Put all, okay. You can see that it's actually updating the balances, the two rows, rather than the singular row that we were changing before. So a good example of doing a top-down budget, so you can come in here through Excel and changing these numbers, which is quite often how people would like to do it. You know, they've got that high-level view and they want to change those numbers. And yes, okay, so we've got Excel, so we can actually minimize that. Okay. Now, the next bit I actually wanted to show you was scheduler. So scheduler can be quite complementary to the budgeting process. So I'll open up the scheduler. So instead of doing those data maintenance things like deleting a specific scope and refreshing the data, you could actually use scheduler to do that. So in this example here, I've got a scheduled task that's going through and actually it's actually replicating the input values. So where in Excel, I had a query that brought out the data and then I did a delete on it and then I did an insert. In Scheduler, I can actually run the whole thing. So I can do a task where I do a query. So I'm feeding a query into a write back, which then deletes based on the ID field. And then I have a query being fed into a write back that then is used to upload the latest data, in this case, into a different version. And running it, so you don't have to run a scheduled task based on a schedule. You can actually go and run it anytime you want. So you just kick it off. You can also put an icon on your desktop, so you can actually rerun it on the desktop if you want. And I've also put a link into the menu for scheduler. So you can actually run your scheduled tasks through the web browser. So if I want to go through and run exactly the same scheduled task that I did through scheduler, I can actually click on this and it's actually going to run it through a web browser. And because it's running on the server, so that's the server location, it's actually running on the server. Just refresh this. Okay, so it only took 1.9 seconds because the data had been cached because it's just been run before. Now, just going back to permissions, since we talked about it, but never really kind of got into it. So if we just have a look at the permissions on scope. So all the main sort of reference tables or dimensional tables have permissions enabled. And when you set up permissions, it's really just creating a row and saying, okay, for this value, in this case, scope, for this specific username. Now, it could be a username, it could be a Windows authenticated user, it could be an Active Directory group. So it doesn't really make any difference in that context. And then you can define whether they've got read, create, update, or delete sort of capabilities. Now, in some cases, there's a little bit of an overlap because if you can create, you can obviously update. But you have no delete capability, so it's been disabled. So in this case here, user 1 can see sales and user 2 can see the fabrication information. If I was to go in and look at the version information, so you can see here that user 1 can see version 1, so he's got access to read, create, and update, but he can't delete anything. He can also see user version 2. And he can also see actual data. Now, there's a number of reasons why you might actually want to put your actuals into this budgeting interface. Apart from the fact that you can do very granular security on it, but it just gives you a level of flexibility and makes the reporting just that little bit easier. But you don't have to. So you could keep your actuals external, and you could then do actual and budget reporting using Sharperlight. So that's not really a problem. But the same sort of concept now with user one, they can read the actuals, but they have no create, update, or delete capabilities, because obviously they can't change the actuals. They should come directly from the ERP system. So that's why those permissions have been set up. Now, a good illustration of the security and the reporting capabilities is, let's say, for example, I run one of the reports. Okay, so as an admin, I can see everything. If I then go and run that same report as user one, you can see that he only, or she, only has access to the sales accounts. So they're tied into, so permissions apply both data entry and reporting. And it's intrinsically, it's basically built into the engine and built into the data model. So it's actually restricting at a row level. Go up here. Now that in itself is a fairly simple sort of report. So we've got actual, budget, and variance from that. But simple reports, you know, you could output that to Excel. So it actually downloads it into an Excel spreadsheet. Okay. So you can see that the structure is pretty much the same as what it is in the web. A couple of other styles of reports. So anything that you could normally do with Sharperlight, you can do with these sort of reports. There's no limitations in that respect. So you could do a department-based report. So you can have different departments based on tabs. Fairly standard sort of reporting. You also get the drill down capability. So if you want to have reports where you drill into both the budgets and the actuals, you can set them up as a drill through, or in this case here, I've got them hyperlinked so that they're a drill to another report. So I could actually just click on one of these and it'll open up a separate tab and a slice of the information. And that slice, my web browser tries to be helpful. So that 50,000, that's that slice of information. And obviously you could have drills on top of drills. So you could have a drill going into more detail if this was at a summary level, or you could have a drill that goes from the budget straight to the actuals, and you could do some variance analysis between the two. And lastly, just going back to the, just refresh that page, we'll just go back to the original sort of dashboard. So the dashboards you can lay out however you want. Again, if you're not familiar with Sharperlight, dashboarding is part of the standard web interface. So you get web-based reports through Publisher. You get web-based dashboards, which can then consume published queries through Publisher. So these are effectively published queries. So, you know, charts, grids, high-level metrics. You can have, in this case here, it's showing all the open approvals. And we've also got a hyperlink where I could actually go to a specific line and edit that specific line. So from within a dashboard, I can actually go away to a data entry form and actually change that and things like that. So a dashboard can be quite useful in consolidating together information and allowing you to report over a larger view of the information. Oh, thank you very much.